What's up, guys? This is new, crazy, read it story.
Title: People who have stopped going to church. What made you stop? I never thought I'd be writing a post like this. If you had asked me a few years ago, I would have sworn that my faith was something that would always be with me, something that would always guide me. I grew up in a religious household, and going to church was just part of the routine. Every Sunday, without fail, my family piled into the car, drove to the small church down the street, and sat through what often felt like endless hours of hymns and sermons. But it was normal. It was just what we did. I think for most of my childhood, I didn't question it. I just followed along because it was what I was supposed to do. It wasn't until I was much older, in my late teens, that I started asking myself more difficult questions about my faith, about what I truly believed in. I remember the first time I voiced these questions to my parents, both of whom were devout Christians. It was the day after a youth group meeting at church, and I'd just been introduced to the idea that other people, with their own beliefs, could be just as valid and just as meaningful. I was struck by the concept. I had always been taught that our religion was the right religion, the only religion. But hearing this from someone who wasn't a preacher or my parents, it made me pause. What if, I asked myself, we're not the only ones with the truth? What if there's more than one path to God? My parents were concerned when I asked these questions, and while they tried to answer as best they could, I could sense they didn't have the same level of curiosity about it. They didn't seem to want to entertain the possibility of doubt. That's when the cracks started to show. The idea that questioning my faith was somehow a bad thing felt strange to me. I mean, we were supposed to be encouraged to ask questions, right? That's what I thought at the time. Eventually, as I got older, I found myself drifting further and further away from the church. At first, it wasn't an active choice. It was more of a passive disinterest. Sundays came, and I found excuses not to go. I had homework. I wanted to sleep in. I was busy. And every time I made a choice to not go, I felt this guilt, this tugging at my conscience. It was almost like a voice in my head saying, "You're letting God down. You should be going to church. You should be with your family." But something inside me started to shift. I started to feel like there was a disconnect between the teachings at church and the real world around me. The church that I had attended for years suddenly felt like it was in a bubble, almost like it was disconnected from the reality of life. The sermons didn't seem to reflect the issues I was dealing with in my day-to-day life. They talked about sin and redemption, about God's love, but when I looked around, I saw a world filled with pain, suffering, and injustice. It felt like there was a disconnect between what the church preached and what I was experiencing in the world. I started volunteering at a local food bank during weekends instead of going to church. I felt like I was doing more tangible good by helping people directly than by sitting in a pew, listening to a sermon that seemed disconnected from the real struggles that people were going through. I began questioning the church's role in society. How could a place of worship be so focused on rituals and traditions when there were people out there who needed help, who needed to be heard? There were other things too, things I hadn't been able to put into words at the time. I began to notice the judgmental attitudes within the church. I couldn't ignore how people who didn't fit into the mold, people who were LGBTQ+, people who were struggling with addiction, people who had made mistakes, were treated differently. I started seeing the hypocrisy. The same people who preached about love and acceptance were the same ones who would talk behind someone's back or look down on people who didn't fit their idea of morality. That bothered me more and more as time went on. Was this really what Christianity was about? Wasn't Jesus supposed to be about love? About helping the marginalized? It didn't seem to line up with what I saw at church. The turning point came a few years ago when I had an argument with a close friend about faith. He had stopped going to church a few years before me, but for different reasons. He had experienced something deeply traumatic, and he couldn't reconcile that with the image of a loving God that was preached in church. He asked, how could a loving God allow all the bad things that happen in the world? I tried to answer with the usual cliches. God works in mysterious ways, or everything happens for a reason. But deep down, I realized that I didn't believe those words anymore. I didn't know why bad things happened. I didn't have an answer for the suffering in the world. That's when I stopped going altogether. I felt like I was going through the motions, but I wasn't really living my faith. It felt like I was just playing a role in a story that I didn't believe in anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that I had the answers when, in reality, I didn't even know the right questions. Since then, I've spent a lot of time reflecting. I've explored other philosophies, other religions, and I've even had moments of spiritual clarity that don't fit neatly into a specific box. I've come to terms with the fact that I may never have all the answers. But the more I've learned, the more I've realized that faith, for me, has become about finding my own path and questioning everything along the way. I'm not angry at the church or at the people who still believe in it. I don't think they're bad people. But for me, it became clear that I couldn't continue being a part of something that didn't align with who I am and what I truly believe. So, to answer the question, I stopped going to church because I started questioning my faith in ways that made me uncomfortable, and I found that the answers I was looking for weren't in a building, in a sermon, or in a prayer. They were in the messy, complicated world around me. I learned that it's okay not to have all the answers, and that it's okay to walk away from something that no longer serves you. I'm not sure where I'm headed spiritually, but I know I'm not alone in my journey, and I know that questioning is a part of growth. Edit. I didn't expect this post to get this much attention. I've received so many messages from people who've shared their own experiences of leaving the church. Some of you have had similar experiences, some of you have gone through different struggles, but what's been the most encouraging is the support and understanding I've gotten. It's nice to know that I'm not the only one who has gone through this. Thank you all for your kindness. This is probably going to be a long post, but I feel like sharing my journey in case it resonates with anyone else who feels similarly. I never thought I'd find myself here, but a few years ago, I stopped going to church, and it wasn't because I didn't want to believe, but because I simply couldn't anymore. I grew up in a small town where everyone went to church. It was just the way things were. Sunday mornings were spent with my family at the local Baptist church, where my dad was one of the deacons. It was a very tight-knit community, and church was at the center of everything. It felt like the right thing to do, even if I didn't fully understand it at the time. But the idea of community, the way people supported each other through good times and bad, was something I took comfort in. As a kid, I didn't question much. The Bible stories, the hymns, the teachings, they all just made sense. I was told that this was the truth, and I believed it because that's what I was raised with. There was this feeling of certainty. If I did what I was supposed to, followed the rules, and believed the right things, everything would be okay. It was comforting, even though I had some doubts deep down. Things started to change when I went off to college. I was away from my family, living in a new place, surrounded by new ideas and people who didn't share my background. It was a culture shock at first. I found myself surrounded by atheists, agnostics, people from other faiths, and people who just didn't care about faith at all. In the beginning, I held tightly to my beliefs. I was still going to church on Sundays, trying to find some place where I belonged. But the more I got to know people, the more questions came up in my mind. I met a few people who challenged my faith, not in an aggressive way, but just through conversations that made me think. The first was a friend I met in my philosophy class. We started talking about the problem of evil, the age-old question. If God is all good and all-powerful, why is there so much suffering in the world? At first, I tried to respond with the usual answers I had been taught. Free will, God's plan, that kind of thing. But the more I thought about it, the less those explanations satisfied me. They felt like band-aids over a much deeper wound. Another friend was from a Muslim background. I had grown up with this firm belief that Christianity was the only true religion and that everyone else was, in some way, lost. But when I talked with him about his faith, I was struck by how deeply he believed in his own truths. He wasn't some heathen who needed saving. He was a kind, thoughtful person, just like me. I started asking myself, how can I believe so strongly that my faith is the only right way when so many other people have their own deeply held beliefs that they live by? I was faced with the uncomfortable reality that maybe I didn't have all the answers. The turning point for me was when I started reading more widely. I explored books about different religions, spiritual practices, and even books by skeptics. I spent time reflecting on my own experiences growing up and how much of my faith was tied to tradition and fear of being wrong, rather than a genuine understanding of what I believed. The more I read and learned, the more my doubts grew. I realized that I didn't just have questions about why I believed, but about what I believed. It started to feel like the beliefs I had been taught were more about following a set of rules and fitting in than actually connecting with something deeper, something beyond me. It wasn't one single moment that made me stop going to church. It was more of a gradual unraveling. There were also some personal experiences that contributed. I saw hypocrisy in the church community. I'd heard sermons that focused more on judging others than on helping people who were actually struggling. There was this strong emphasis on morality, but no real attention given to the systemic issues that caused people suffering. The church was more concerned with the way people dressed or who they were dating than with feeding the hungry or caring for the homeless. It felt like the church had lost its way, lost its focus on what really mattered. The final straw came when a family member was going through a difficult time. They were in a serious crisis, emotionally and mentally, and they reached out to the church for support. Instead of compassion and understanding, they were met with judgment. There was talk of sin and how they needed to get right with God. The judgment, the lack of empathy, it really broke something inside of me. I couldn't reconcile the image of a loving, compassionate God with the response that was given. I remember thinking, if this is what church is about, if this is what faith is supposed to look like, then maybe I don't want it anymore. And so I stopped going. It wasn't a dramatic moment where I declared that I would never set foot in a church again. It wasn't like I suddenly became an atheist, I didn't. But the routine of church attendance felt hollow. I wasn't being spiritually fed, I wasn't growing. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay, that everything fit neatly into the boxes I had been given. After I stopped going to church, I spent some time exploring other spiritual practices. I read about Buddhism, Hinduism, and different philosophical ideas. I even dabbled in meditation and mindfulness. I started to learn that spirituality wasn't about adhering to a set of rules or conforming to a group, but about how I connected with the world around me, how I learned to be present, and how I could live a life that was true to my values. I still consider myself spiritual. I still believe in something greater than myself, but I don't feel the need to be in a church to experience that connection. I've found my own path, one that is still unfolding. And while I sometimes miss the community aspect of church, I've come to realize that I can find connection in other places too. In nature, in conversations with friends, in acts of kindness. It's been a journey, and I'm still on it. Maybe I'll find my way back to church one day. But for now, I'm content with where I am. The most important thing I've learned through all of this is that it's okay to question, it's okay to change, and it's okay to walk away from something that doesn't resonate with you anymore. I think that's what true faith is, finding what is authentic to you, no matter where that takes you.